The ancient witness this morning is from Luke 4, verse 16 through 20. On one of these days of resting, Creator sets free returned to his boyhood home in the seed planter village. As was his tradition, he entered the gathering house and stood up to read from the ancient sacred teachings. The headman handed him the scroll from the words of the prophet, Creator will help us. He opened the scroll and began to read. The Spirit of Creator has come to rest on me. He has chosen me to tell the good story to the ones who are poor. He has sent me to mend broken hearts, to tell prisoners they have been set free, to make the blind see again, and to lift up the ones who have been pushed down, to make it known that Creator's year of setting free has come at last. He rolled up the scroll and returned it to the headman and sat down. All eyes were fixed on him, wondering what he would say. And this from Mark 1, verses 14 and 15. Then later, after Gift of Goodwill was arrested, Creator sets free traveled to the circle of nations to tell the good story. The time has now come, he said to the people. Creator's good road is right in front of you. It is time to return to the right ways of thinking and doing. Put your trust in this good story I am bringing to you.
The doctrine of what is called the doctrine of discovery, so I thought introducing that would be this short YouTube clip of what that, kind of what we're talking about when we use that title.
Hi there, this is Jim Thunder from Reconciliation Thunder, and we're continuing on with our History for Reconciliation video series. So today we're stopping about 1452, 1493, around that area. We're talking about the doctrine of discovery. So, quick summary, the doctrine of discovery comes to us from 3 papal bulls. What's a papal bull? Well, the Pope of the day would issue a decree or a statement, and these were often referred to as papal bulls, based off of the type of material that the decree was written upon. So we have 3 of them specifically. We have Inter Caetera, Romanus Pontifex, and Dum Diversas. So between all of these, we see this concept called the doctrine of discovery, and we see the concept of terra nullius. So terra means land, and nullius means void and empty. So basically, this concept taught that if these lands, these new lands that are being discovered, if they are not being cultivated and used for agriculture, and if they're not claimed already by Christians, then they can be up for discovery. They can be discovered, and they can be claimed by virtue of discovery. This concept taught that the indigenous nations that occupied these lands could be considered nothing more than flora and fauna. So the impacts of this doctrine has been devastating as we look across the centuries. Think of all the time in which these concepts have existed. They've entered American case law through the Marshall Trilogy. They've entered Canadian case law through the St. Catharines Milling and Lumber Company versus the Queen. And they have done tremendous damage to Indigenous nations all across Turtle Island. So what is the impact, and what is the significance to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action? Well, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission specifically referred to terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery multiple times. We look, for example, at call to action 45, 46, 47, and 49. And we look at these references as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission telling us that these are important, that these matter, that these need to be repudiated. And so we've seen some progress. We've seen church leaders issue statements from different denominations repudiating the doctrine of discovery. We saw the Pope recently repudiate the doctrine of discovery. But more work needs to be done. The wording of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission states that we need to repudiate concepts such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. It's a catch-all term. We need to find all such legal principles and we need to repudiate them. We also need to look all throughout Canadian society and find these principles and repudiate them, nullify them, and correct our understanding of what title and sovereignty actually mean in Canada. So that is a quick summary of terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery. I'm Jim Thunder from Reconciliation Thunder. Continue to follow our History for Reconciliation video series. Thank you so much.
Well, that sort of gives you an idea, perhaps, of this 500-year-old document that still did a great damage and still has ramifications today. I want to say that, as we probably already know, words are not harmless. They can point, in fact, I would say words are some of the most powerful tools we have as human beings. Words and stories can construct in such a way as to inspire and build up for imagining and seeing a new and more just world. Or they can name a reality for what it really is by giving voice to the idea of what we call truth and love, the ideas that I'm charged to try to convey from the pulpit, but you are too. We all have that. Words can heal old wounds, beginning with phrases like, "I'm sorry, I was wrong. How can I repair some of the damage that I have caused, or the damage that was done for which I have received unwarranted power and privilege?" Words can also, as we know, inflame or give justification for some of the most horrendous acts we humans can impose upon others and upon creation. As we learned, or maybe relearned, a decree was written long ago, 500 years ago, called the Doctrine of Discovery, which gave false justification for European greed and avarice and violence against peoples who had the unfortunate disadvantage of a different technology that lacked brute force that we had, guns that we, i.e., the European settler types. Most of our origins come from that. We had guns. We had a particular penchant for navigation and conquering. And we subjected people to diseases that decimated them. The papal Christian decree during the so-called Age of Discovery gave the religious sanctioning for enslavement of Africans and the displacement of indigenous peoples everywhere, especially in the Americas. Mind you, this was a religious document. We need to let that sink in. This was a religious document based on Christianity. This is a document that ought to remind us of the extreme danger of what can happen when institutional religions wed themselves with state power. Amazingly, in our times, even with access to hindsight and that offers us new perspectives and wisdom and knowledge, many are still blind to this danger. There's much talk these days in certain circles from many who would want to see church-state magnified and revived. I'm speaking mainly of the current American fundamentalist, far-right, white evangelical mindset, getting bolder and bolder of talking of such theocratic notions. We also have a strong contingent of churches, namely the mainline churches, the Methodists, the UCC, the Mennonites, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, I believe, the Episcopalians, some elements, many elements within the Catholic Church, the Pope himself, who have come out within the past couple of decades to renounce the doctrine of discovery. And mind you, just because the doctrine of discovery originated from papal minds 500 years ago, we as Protestants, consciously or unconsciously, have adopted it. All of us who come from settler stock, predominantly Northern Europeans, are complicit in this criminal decree as we stand on this land. Mind you, we didn't choose this, but we are the great, I don't know how far back, grandchildren of those who did. And here we all are. We can say we own these lands because of the religious statement made 500 years ago and the mindset that went with it. Despite ignorance and maybe even good intentions, the doctrine of discovery infected the minds of much of our missionary work to Christianize the heathens, to save lost souls, to bring civilization to the uncivilized. And don't get me wrong, there was and is much good brought to peoples through missionary endeavors. Hospitals, education, literacy, and yes, the gospel. But it was brought from an assumed place of power over rather than power with. My wife's grandfather and grandmother were missionaries. They served in Kenya in the early to mid 20th century. They helped not only to start churches, but also establish hospitals and schools. I've been to where my grandparents-in-law did their work. In 2007, my family visited one particular village where my relatives did their ministry. There's a hospital there that they helped establish almost 100 years ago. It started out as a very rudimentary clinic, and today, in this somewhat remote rural setting, this hospital is an important place of healing. Western healing, mind you, but healing, care, and medical attention. That, I would say, is one of the gifts that missionary work did and does. We have a family photo of my grandfather-in-law. He is waist deep, wearing a white suit and sporting a white pith helmet. I thought that was just in the movies. It's a classic image. Around him are a number of locals receiving baptism, while the rest of the congregation stand on the banks to witness those who are symbolically receiving this important sacrament of faith. When I saw that photo years ago, I thought, wow, that's cool. The quintessential image of a missionary baptizing the local folks. But now, many years later, as I consider this image through the lens of colonialism and empire and the doctrine of discovery, I see this as a more complex image. I now see this as, in part, the quintessential image of white privilege and Christian blindness to the seductive power of church and empire. My grandfather's in-laws' intentions were good. I would even say there was amazing noble intent and courage and sacrifice of the missionaries of that era. He was a strong advocate of handing over church leadership and control to the local people. But I also ask myself, how might missionary work have looked different if colonial mentality had not infected the subconscious motives of missionary endeavors? What if we had shared the gospel as Jesus preached it? To announce good news to the poor, to free the captives, to heal the blind, to declare now the year of the Lord's favor, that is, the year of freeing everyone from what holds people down, greed, debt, oppression. I wonder how a theology of power with, rather than a power over, might have changed the course of history, hopefully for the better. I wonder what a theology of sharing of wealth and and more importantly, sharing of wisdom and worldview and coming at it from the place of learning might have looked like. I wonder how a theology of openness and wonder and expansion and evolution might have changed history. Sadly, we will not know. But we do know the fruits of what happened, or what happens when we dehumanize others for the sake of greed, perhaps fueled with ignorance and fear, and supported by bad theology. In our first gospel reading, as is what I will call Jesus' short, or actually it's a second gospel reading from Mark, is a short three-point sermon from Jesus. 1, the kingdom of God is at hand, here and now in this world. 2, repent. This is not a feeling, but an action. It means to turn around, to go another way, to go a better way. And 3, believe the good news, not the good/bad news that you are terrible and damned to hell unless you conform to a certain creed or prayer, but the truly good news that the Spirit is alive, that God desires the thriving of all creation, that the oppressed need not be oppressed, nor the oppressors and the systems of oppression need to prevail, that this world is a garden, not a prison camp, and we are invited by Jesus to believe the good news. As I was considering this sermon, I couldn't help but also think of the current and awful situation in Gaza. Ultimately, it seems it isn't. It is, actually, not isn't. Ultimately, the question I have, isn't it fundamentally about land? Who gets to claim it? Who gets to live in it, on it? Who gets to control it? Who gets the right to live under their own vine and fig tree in peace and none afraid? This has to be the vision for everyone. As I read the gospel, not just for one particular group of people, not just for a few chosen. As Martin King famously said, all are oppressed until none are oppressed. As I say in almost every sermon, we are interconnected beings, or as Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk, said, interbeings. We are as much as we are human beings. In this issue of tribalism, fighting over land, goes back to the earliest beginnings of our faith roots. I went back to read from Deuteronomy 20, supposedly Yahweh's instructions to Moses about the rules of engagement for taking the promised land away from the Canaanites who were living in said lands. In verse 10 of chapter 20, when you draw near to a town to fight against it, offer it terms of peace. All right, that sounds good. It goes downhill from there. If it accepts your terms of peace and surrenders to you, then all the people in it shall serve you at forced labor. If it does not submit to you peacefully, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. And when the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you shall put all its males to the sword. You may, however, take as your booty the women and children, livestock, and everything else in the town, all its spoil. You may enjoy the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. Thus you shall treat all the towns that are very far from you, which are not towns of the nations here. But as for the towns of these people that the Lord your God has given you as an inheritance, you must not let anything that breathes remain alive. You shall annihilate them. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, just as the Lord your God has commanded, so that they may not teach you to do all the abhorrent things that they do for their gods, and thus sin against the Lord your God. I don't know, that doesn't sound like gospel to me. None of us with any sensibilities of humanity would ascribe to this. When we read these troublesome passages, we have to say, this can't be gospel. This isn't faith. This can't really even be Judaism. But this really And then the question is, did this really happen or was it made up? The motives of which one can only guess at. And so I looked into this matter and I went to some articles written for the Biblical Archaeological Society. From that source, which I would consider reputable, I am much relieved to learn that from an archaeological perspective, there is no evidence for such genocide and brutality. The more likely scenario is that there was a slow and steady assimilation process as people moved in. I'm quoting here, the archaeological evidence indicates that the rise of Israel was a relatively peaceful process. The early Israelites were mostly local Canaanites who settled in the previously sparsely populated highlands. Any battles with Canaanites would have occurred later, with the expansion of Israel into the lowland valleys, as described in Judges 5. The wholesale destruction of the Canaanites is a later historiographical fiction. The story may still be morally troubling, but we shouldn't assume that it really happened. I'm much relieved. So likely, thankfully, the wholesale slaughter likely did not happen. The story for some, including the American mythology of manifest destiny, relied on such stories to give unholy justification for the sanctioning of overtaking whole nations and cultures. On the North American continent, on the South American continent, on the African continent, India, the Pacific Islands, the Arab lands of the Middle East, the effects of this 500-year history of colonization on our world today is, and I don't think I exaggerate, the root of much of the entirety of warring nations against one another. And this is not to suggest that colonizations and wars haven't existed before, but never on the scale before the era of modern empire. Again, it is the whole issue of whose land is this? Whose tribe gets to have power? Whose lifestyle gets to be fueled by the plundering of the earth's resources? Humanity, it seems, is forced to come to terms with some realities right now, as never before. We are at a historical crossroads. If there is to be a future for our children, we have to say this twisted relationship we have to the land cannot go on. We need a new theology that puts sharing, cooperation, and stewardship at the forefront of a new kind of economics. It first begins with truth-telling, and then it must move forward towards some kind of new way, perhaps some kind of restitution. It is true, we cannot fix much of this, but we can move forward and make for a better day and try to make right what has been wrong. And here's where our Native brothers and sisters have much to teach us. I want to be careful not to misrepresent Native understandings with a romanticized white person's imaginings. I'm obviously not Native. That said, I want to close with some words inspired by a speech given by Chief Seattle in 1854. He gave it to an audience of the Washington Territory, and present there was Governor Stevens, known for his militaristic approach toward Native peoples. The Chief Seattle's words were not recorded, but were later recalled 30 years later by a man named Henry Smith, a doctor, poet, early white settler who had been present to Chief Seattle's words. And so while the spirit of the words I'm about to read are worthy of considering, the accuracy of the actual words are reconstructed and much embellished with poetic recall. Later in 1970, Smith's recalled words were further embellished by Susan Jeffers, who popularized the speech in her book, Brother Eagle, Sister Sky. Side note to this idea of rewriting heard, said, recollected words. We have to remember also that many of the epistles in our Bible have been ascribed to the Apostle Paul, but from the best scholars can tell, some of them were written in Paul's name a number of years, generations later. We also have to remember that our Gospels themselves were written, recollected about the life of Jesus 40, 50, 60 years later. So with that disclaimer made, I still believe the truth and the poetry of the words I'm about to read capture a perspective of spirit and land that we would do well to contemplate. So, I appreciate it. This is going to be like storytelling time with kids. How can you buy the sky? Chief Seattle began. How can you own the rain and the wind? My mother told me every part of the earth is sacred to our people. Every pine, needle, every sandy shore, every mist in the dark woods, every meadow and humming insect are all holy in the memory of our people. My father said to me, I know the sap that courses through the trees as I know the blood that flows in my veins. We are part of the earth, and it is a part of us. The perfume flowers are our sisters. The bear, the deer, the great eagle, these are our brothers. The rocky crests, the meadows, the ponies, all belong to the same family. The voice of my ancestors said to me, the shining waters that moves in the streams and rivers is not simply water, but the blood of your grandfather's grandfather. Each ghostly reflection in the clear waters of the lakes tells of memories in the life of our people. The waters murmur in the voice of your great-great-grandmother. The rivers are our brothers. They quench our thirst. They carry our canoes, feed our children. You must give to the rivers the kindness you would give to any brother. The voice of my grandfather said to me, the air is precious. It shares its spirit with all the life it supports. The wind that gave me my first breath also received my last sigh. You must keep the land and air apart and sacred as a place where one can go to taste the wind that is sweetened by the meadow flowers. When the last red man and woman have vanished from their wilderness and their memory is only a shadow of a cloud moving across the prairie, will the shores and the forests still be there? Will there be any of the spirit of my people left? My ancestors said to me, this we know, the earth does not belong to us, we belong to the earth. The voice of my grandmother said to me, teach your children what you have been taught. The earth is our mother. What befalls the earth befalls the sons and daughters of the earth. Hear my voice, said the voice of my ancestors, Chief Jewell said. The destiny of your people is a mystery to us. What will happen when the buffalo are slaughtered, the wild horses tamed? What will happen when the secret corners of the forest are heavy with the scent of men? When the view of the ripe hills is blotted by talking wires, where will the thicket be gone? Where will the eagle be gone? What will happen when we say goodbye to the swift pony and the hunt? It will be the end of living and the beginning of survival. We know this, all things are connected like the blood that unites us. We do not weave the web of life, we are merely a strand in it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. We love the earth as a newborn loves its mother's heartbeat. If we sell you our land, care for it as we have cared for it. Hold in your mind the memory of the land as it is when you receive it. Preserve the land and the air and the rivers of your children's children, and love it as we have loved it. Good words. Whatever their source was or is, truth is found where truth is found.